Good morning, everyone. Welcome back again to our second session. I would like to welcome also Professor Rafael Scopacasa, who is here with us today with a lecture on Brazilian history. Thank you very much, Professor, for being with us. I hope you have enjoyed, you all have enjoyed our lecture from yesterday, and I am 100% sure you're going to enjoy very much Professor Rafael's lecture. He's been with us for some years now, right, Professor? And we always like to invite him back because we have such insightful information in class. So please, Professor, you may start.
Well, thank you very much, Luciana, for that very nice introduction. It's always such a treat to receive the invitation, and I'm very glad to be here, as always. I'd like to thank you and all the organizers for putting together this, this great sequence of talks. And it's always, like I said, it's always a thrill. It's always very exciting. So thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you a little bit today about the history of Brazil. I always begin these talks by pointing out that I'm not a Brazilian history expert, even though I am Brazilian, and that somehow makes me feel entitled to speak about Brazilian history. I'm not an expert in Brazilian history per se. I'm actually an ancient history person. My specialty is Roman history. But it's always very exciting to come back to Brazilian history because it's so interesting, and there's always new information that that comes about. So I'm very keen to, as always, to come and talk to you, discuss with you a little bit about Brazilian history. Next slide, please. Okay, well, I can't actually see the slides. Thank you. That's excellent. Thank you very much. So that's the introductory slide. If you could move on to the, yes, that's the one. Thank you very much. So as you know, when we talk about history, we're basically talking about time. Yes, we're talking about time, and more specifically about the passage of time and what that does to human behavior. Next slide, please. In the 1930s and 40s, a French historian named Fernand Braudel came up with a very important idea that had a huge impact on the way that historians thought about time. According to Braudel, when it comes to human societies, time just doesn't flow at the same rate. It doesn't always flow at the same rate. Rather, he believed that there were different levels or different layers of time which move at different speeds, so to speak. Next slide, please. For example, Braudel argued that political events, such as elections, happen at a very quick pace, and that this is the level where historical change is most perceptible, is most visible to us. Next slide, please. Whereas Braudel believed that changes tend to happen more slowly at the economic level, moving in cycles that take decades or sometimes even centuries to complete. Next slide, please. And then we have what Braudel called the long duration, or longue durée in French, meaning those changes that happen so slowly that they're barely perceptible to the naked eye, to the extent that time almost seems to stand still, as it were. Next slide, please. So this theory about the different rates of change can be very useful when thinking about history in general and Brazilian history in particular. Because it shows us, for one thing, that the past is not something that is separate from the present. On the contrary, Brodel's durations theory proposes that what we call the present, or the present moment, is actually made up of different bits or different strands, threads of the past, which sometimes can get tangled up in the most interesting ways. Next slide, please. Now, some of these threads or bits of the past, as I call them, that make up present-day Brazil, can be seen to stretch back into the colonial era, while others go even deeper, and they relate to issues such as slavery and racism. Next slide, please. They relate to issues of social inequality. Next slide, please. And also they relate to issues of political authoritarianism. This Vargas character is the one at the center, the one with the cigar. We will get to him later. Next slide, please. But we also have a lot that's to do with other issues, such as resilience and survival. Next slide, please. Issues pertaining to cultural diversity. Next slide, please. And also truly amazing, I would say, native civilizations that are more ancient and more complex than anything that we've imagined until now. Next slide, please. So in my talk today, I want to give you a rough outline of these guiding threads, as it were, in Brazil's history. And I want to briefly follow with you some of their developments in time. Now, I plan to go as far as the 1980s, and I'm going to leave the last few decades, like current affairs, to my colleagues who will be presenting the succeeding lectures. And as you can see, I'm going to be dividing my talk into four main parts, which roughly follow a chronological sequence. So this is mainly for structure. Next slide, please. And I want to start with the so-called pre-Columbian or pre-colonial period that stretches back into the deep and still rather unknown, still rather mysterious past of South America. So let's delve into this deep past for a bit. Next slide, please. Before the Europeans arrived in 1500, people had been living in Brazil for at least 12,000 years. And I'm very proud to say that scientists here at UFMG are at the cutting edge of studies into the ancient peopling of the Americas. A team of experts from the biology department here at UFMG have recently published a paper where they concluded that South America was occupied relatively quickly, and by that I mean in the space of some 2,000 years, so it's very relative. Occupied relatively quickly from people coming from the Bering Ice Bridge that existed at the time and which connected Asia and North America. So people crossed this ice bridge and would have gone along down the Pacific coast. And this would have happened some 15,000 years ago, more or less. Next slide, please. What you're seeing there is a place called the Serra da Capivara National Park. It's located in the northeast of Brazil, in the state of Piauí. And it's really important. It's a very important site for our understanding of Brazil's deep history, because Serra da Capivara contains the largest concentration of known prehistoric archaeological sites, not just in Brazil, but in all of the Americas, apparently. Next slide, please. We know that this area was already occupied as early as 12,500 years ago, the area of the Serra da Capivara National Park. And even though these societies that inhabited the area didn't develop any writing system that is normally identified, that is conventionally identified as such, they did leave behind some incredible examples of rock art, some of which you can see, which show various types of scenes that involve mostly collective activities of various kinds, of different kinds. Next slide, please. Some of these scenes are rather difficult for us to try and decipher, which raises the intriguing question of what were these ancient Brazilian societies like? Next slide, please. Now, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read this very interesting book. Don't be put off by the catchy title. It was published recently. I think it came out in September last year, September 2021. So it's still relatively fresh. And in my opinion, it's actually a very engaging discussion that challenges some of our preconceptions, or that seeks to challenge some of our preconceptions about human history in general, and more specifically about the development of so-called complex societies. Now, according to the authors, David Graeber and David Wengrow, we have this tendency to think that human societies started off as small and egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers, right? And we tend to assume that the development of agriculture led necessarily to larger and more hierarchical, more unequal societies, where you start to get things like private property, systems of government, administration, bureaucracy, writing, record keeping, not to mention things like taxation, organized warfare, social inequality, etc., etc. Now, I agree with the authors, David Graeber and David Wengrow, that this kind of narrative really has shaped much of our understanding of what we might call deep history, even though we may not be aware of it. And I also think that it's refreshing the way they try to argue that this narrative is false, is flawed in basic ways. For example, they try to show that there's plenty of archaeological evidence indicating that people in prehistory were much more dynamic than we tend to assume. And that people in prehistory experimented with a wide range of social and political arrangements, surprising even, which went way beyond our traditional image of prehistoric hunter-gatherers. So it's well worth the read, I recommend it. And what's especially interesting for us is that the authors often refer to ancient Brazil as a source of examples and as a source of case studies that they use to make their points. Next slide, please. For example, they recall that until not too long ago, and by that I mean the 1980s, Amazonia, the region of the Amazon rainforest, was regarded by anthropologists as a kind of magical window that allowed us to catch a glimpse of our deep evolutionary past. The communities inhabiting the area were seen as lone survivors of a lost age when humanity was still in its so-called state of nature, be it the state of nature that was peaceful, that was imagined as peaceful and benevolent, along the lines that Jean-Jacques Rousseau proposed in the 1750s, or the more unpleasant version of the idea of the state of nature that Thomas Hobbes envisaged in the 17th century, according to which, as you know, the absence of government means constant fighting, constant and ruthless fighting among people. Indeed, the Yanomami of Amazonia were at one point seen as a kind of living illustration of Hobbes's rather bleak, rather pessimistic idea of the state of nature. And this was because of the supposedly warlike culture of the Yanomami. Next slide, please. Now, these stereotypical images are now giving way to much more dynamic, not to mention much more scientifically accurate understandings. Research techniques such as aerial photography and geophysical survey are showing that actually this whole area of Amazonia was apparently very densely settled by rather complex, but also highly versatile societies in the pre-Columbian era. Next slide, please. By the start of the Christian era, some 2,000 years ago, these Amazonian civilizations, it seems, were very much familiar with agriculture and animal domestication. And indeed, there's evidence that manioc, or cassava, was already being cultivated in the Amazon as early as 9,000 years ago. Next slide, please. These ancient Amazonian societies were also building monumental structures, not just geometrically precise buildings and earthworks, but also large terraces, towns even, and also apparently a network of roads that ran across the entire Amazon basin and connected these Amazonian communities with the Andean civilizations to the west, as well as with the Caribbean islands to the north. Next slide, please. And yet, according to Graeber and Wengrow, these societies somehow managed to avoid developing rigid and oppressive forms of hierarchy and control. And this, according to them, would have had something to do with seasonality, which is an important word. Seasonality, which is the basically it's the ability to switch between different forms of social, economic, and political organization, depending on the season of the year. And sometimes these are rather different forms of political, social, and economic organization. Now, based on both archaeological and some modern ethnographic data, the authors Graeber and Wengrow suggest that Amazonian peoples spent half the year living in the form of bigger groups that were presided over by chiefs, and the other half of the year in smaller and more mobile groups of foragers, where very different rules of interpersonal behavior and power relations would have applied. It's very interesting. It's an interesting hypothesis. Next slide, please. In terms of the cultural identity of these ancient Brazilian civilizations, we know that by some 2,000 years ago, many of them spoke a series of languages, and one of the main ones appears to have been the Tupi language, or the Tupi language family. The Tupi speakers seem to have originated on the easternmost edge of Amazonia, which is the area that's marked out as Mosaic Zone in purple that you can see on the map. And these Tupi speakers apparently began to expand out of this area around the same time that the Romans were conquering Western Europe, to put things in perspective. Now, there are many possible reasons behind the so-called Tupi expansion, such as demographic growth, or possibly land hunger. Other scholars think that it might have had something to do with climate change, which seems to have drastically reduced the Amazon rainforest around some 2,000 years ago. Be that as it may, the name that these Tupi speakers gave to the lands that they came to occupy was apparently the word that you can see on the bottom right-hand side of the slide there, Pindorama. Can you see it? Pindorama, which might translate as something like the land of the palm trees, or there will be palm trees. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that this so-called Tupi expansion encountered other indigenous groups who spoke very different languages. Many of them spoke a language which is known as the Jê language. And as a result of the Tupi expansion, these Jê speakers moved into, well, they moved far into the uplands of central Brazil, or at least that's one of the proposed historical reconstructions. Next slide, please. And it's also curious that the name by which the Tupi called these Jê speakers was Tapuia, which is somewhere between foreigner, stranger, and barbarian. And here you see an image of people who were identified as Tapuia. But this is obviously a much later depiction. It was painted by a Dutch artist called Albert Eckhout in the 17th century. And this leads me to the next major topic. Next slide, please. Thank you. Which is the arrival of the Europeans. Obviously, this event marked a whole new epoch, a whole new era in the history of these ancient Brazilian civilizations. So now it's time for us to start taking a closer look, albeit brief, at this what I call the colonial encounter. Next slide, please. So the first thing we need to know is that by the time the Portuguese arrived in Brazil in April 1500, Portugal was running a very prosperous commercial empire that stretched across the entire globe, with outposts in Africa, India, and even China, and even all the way as far as Japan in the 16th century. By that point, the Portuguese had just discovered, so to speak, the ocean route from Europe to Asia via the African coast, via the Cape of Good Hope. And the Portuguese state was certainly reaping the benefits of this in the first half of the 16th century, mostly by controlling the spice trade between Europe and the East, which was very profitable. Next slide, please. But it wouldn't be long before this commercial empire began to falter. By the mid-16th century, by the 1550s, Portugal was already being superseded by other European nations, chiefly Spain. And this helps to explain why it was that the Portuguese crown decided to focus its attention and its efforts on Brazil at around that time, around the mid-16th century. For example, it wasn't until 1530 that the first serious efforts to occupy Brazil, to settle what we might call Portuguese South America, started to happen. And it's worth pointing out that this might be what you're seeing is probably the first mapa mundi, the first world map to show the Brazilian landmass, which you can see in the bottom left corner. The Portuguese initially thought that Brazil was an island. Next slide, please. These initial efforts at colonization involved the creation of the so-called captaincies, which were the main administrative units of the colony, at least theoretically. In good nautical fashion, what the Portuguese did was they marked off slices of territory, as you can see, using this instrument called the sextant, which you see on the right. It's a nautical instrument. Next slide, please. Now, what I'm about to say is a gross oversimplification of Brazilian history, and if my Brazilian history colleagues were here, they would be definitely taken aback. But I suppose it would be fair to say that in the eyes of the Portuguese crown, Brazil was basically a rather large and attractive cash cow, which was there to be exploited as much as possible and with as little effort as possible. So in a sense, and again, this is an oversimplification, the entire colonial period can be summarized as a series of exploitation-driven economic booms. First, you have the sugarcane and tobacco boom, the sugarcane and tobacco plantations that developed on the coast of Brazil in the 16th and 17th centuries, from north to south. And these sugar farms employed slave labor, mostly the labor of enslaved Africans, and we will get to that in a minute. But they also employed indigenous slave labor as well. Next slide, please. Then towards the 1700s, you have the gold rush in Minas Gerais, which is, as you may know, is the state where UFMG is based. And this 18th century gold rush was followed by other economic booms, mainly the rubber boom in the Amazon area, and also the coffee boom towards the south in São Paulo. And both of these, the rubber boom and the coffee boom, actually began in the 19th century. And so they carry into the post-independence period, which we will get to in a bit. Next slide, please. Now, admittedly, Brazilian history is a lot more complicated and interesting than what I just said. But for one thing, I think it's important to note that in many respects, the colonial era sort of foreshadows the ways in which modern Brazil would eventually function, especially from an economic and social point of view. For example, the slave society that developed as a result of this colonial encounter in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries is arguably at the root, at the basis of the social inequality problems that plague Brazil to this day. Next slide, please. So now let's move a little closer and look at some of the people who were involved in this colonial encounter and how they coped with everything. I want to begin by talking a little bit about those indigenous societies that we discussed just now. Now, we know that many indigenous people intermarried, either willingly or not. In many cases, it wasn't voluntary, but they intermarried with Portuguese colonists. And these Portuguese colonists were, by the way, mostly male. So the indigenous peoples either intermarried with the colonists or they moved, again, forcibly or not, into colonial settlements, such as those plantations that I just mentioned, where sugar, tobacco, and spirits were being produced for export. Now, the first children of Europeans and Amerindians were called mamelucos, and this is a Portuguese term which roughly corresponds to the Spanish word mestizo, which was being used at the time in the Spanish colonies of Central and Southern America. This process of intermarriage helped form the demographic basis of Brazil's population, although the African element was also very important, as we will see in a moment. But just to give you an idea, genetics research today suggests that all modern Brazilians are, on average, 8% Amerindian from a genetic point of view. Next slide, please. It's also important to remember that many indigenous communities were converted into Catholicism by the Jesuit priests or Jesuits who came to Brazil from the 16th century and were very active between the 16th and 18th centuries. These Jesuits normally set up missions or colleges, and these colleges were located either inside indigenous villages or immediately next to them. Next slide, please. Among the most famous of these Jesuits was a person called José de Anchieta. It seems that this was a rather interesting person, by all accounts, quite a remarkable character who came originally from the Canary Islands and who lived in Brazil for most of his life during the very beginning of Portuguese colonization. José de Anchieta wrote, among other things, ethnographic and linguistic treatises, studies, if you will, about the native societies. And these treatises by Anchieta are very valuable today because they're a very important source of information, for example, on the old Tupi language. Next slide, please. But despite all this, we're not necessarily talking about people, indigenous people, being completely acculturated or completely westernized. To be sure, and I want to stress this, the colonial encounter meant horrible things to the indigenous populations. It meant enslavement, it meant displacement, and it also meant genocide for many indigenous communities. But we also have evidence, and this is also important to stress, that these people showed a great deal of resilience, and some of them seem to have developed unique strategies to adapt to this new and disconcerting situation in which they found themselves. And I want to give you an example of this. Already in the 1500s, we hear about indigenous individuals, indigenous chiefs specifically, who converted to Christianity and then went on to adopt European names and become wealthy landowners. One person, one example of this was a man called Arariboya. Now, this Arariboya was chief of a whole community, the Temimino community, the Temimino people who at the time inhabited the area around the city of Rio, what later went on to become the city of Rio. Around the mid-16th century, this Arariboya and his followers helped the Portuguese to drive out the French from Rio. The French were attempting to establish a colony of their own in Rio, a colony which they very poetically decided to name Antarctic France, but it didn't work. They were driven out. And in return for his services to the Portuguese crown, Arariboya was given a European name. He was named Martim Afonso de Souza. And he was also given a very large estate, which his descendants carried on administering. So in many ways, we could say that this indigenous man became a colonial settler. Do you see? And we don't know how many more people were like him, but there may have been other people like him. Arariboya and his descendants probably learned Portuguese as a result of their dealings with the Portuguese crown, but it's also very likely that they carried on speaking their own native language in their private lives, for example, in many areas of their lives. So that gives us something to think about. Next slide, please. And there's one interesting piece of evidence that points in this direction, the direction of cultural continuity throughout the colonial period, despite the disruptive interventions of the Portuguese crown. There's one interesting piece of evidence, and that is the fact that all the way down to the 19th century, the main language that was spoken in Brazil was not Portuguese. You may think that it was, but it wasn't. It wasn't Portuguese that was mainly spoken in Brazil until the 19th century. The language that was mainly spoken, especially in São Paulo, like towards the south of the colonies, it wasn't Portuguese. It was Nheengatu, the language called Nheengatu. And the word Nheengatu is a Tupi word. You may remember the Tupi from our previous discussion. And Nheengatu means something like general language or lingua franca. It consisted of elements from the Tupi language, but also from other indigenous languages. Nheengatu, as I said, was spoken well into the 19th century, but at that point it was stamped out. It was made illegal in the 19th century. And that was when efforts to Europeanize Brazil began to be made. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a while. But these efforts at Europeanization were not completely successful, as you can see in the slide. Here you have some examples of Nhangatu words that are still very much alive in modern-day Brazilian Portuguese. For example, the word capivara, which you see on the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side. The capivara is a rodent. It's native to South America, as well as the word mingau, which you can see towards the left, the upper left of the slide. Mingau is a kind of porridge. And also the word cuya right next to it. See, at the center. A cuya is something like a bowl or a gourd. See, there are many indigenous words that are still part of our vocabulary. Historically, that's really important. Next slide, please. It wasn't uncommon for indigenous communities to side with the Portuguese against other indigenous groups. Bands of armed men who came to be known as the standard bearers, or bandeirantes in Portuguese, started to roam the hinterlands in the 17th and 18th centuries, the hinterlands of Brazil, in search of spoils and people to enslave. Now, the interesting thing is that indigenous people often made up these bands. They often made up the cohorts of these bandeirantes. And they fought, which means that they fought alongside Europeans against other indigenous peoples. So this was a very common phenomenon. And in fact, some of the leading standard bearers, or bandeirantes, were themselves of indigenous origins, apparently. Next slide, please. So up until now, we've talked a little bit about the indigenous peoples, their encounter with the Europeans, and how they coped. It's now time for us to look at another major demographic group that made up colonial Brazilian society. Brazil received more Africans through the Atlantic slave trade than any other country in the world. And this is not an exaggeration, just to give you some figures that will allow you to put things in perspective. There's an estimated 10 to 12 million people, 10 to 12 million Africans who were forcibly brought to the Americas between 1500 and 1880. The Caribbean area received apparently around 48% of these people, and Brazil about 41%. So more or less the same. And this means 41% means something like approximately 4 million souls. Whereas, on the other hand, the British colonies in North America, the US, received only 5% of this total. So obviously this situation created some very strong historical ties between Brazil and Africa, which are very conspicuous, very much alive until this day. For example, the Brazilian state of Bahia, which is the state just north of Minas Gerais, where UFMG is based. Bahia is estimated to house the largest population of African-descended individuals outside of Africa. So that gives you an idea. Next slide, please. Most of the Africans who were forcibly brought to Brazil between the 16th and 19th centuries came from two African regions, specifically the region of Angola in the west and the region of the Congo, also to the west, but slightly further north. And it's important to remember that the ocean crossing, the Atlantic crossing for these people was absolutely cruel. An estimated 15% of the people died during the journey. And this British abolitionist pamphlet from the late 18th century gives you an idea of just how horrible conditions aboard these slave ships were. Next slide, please. Those who managed to survive the Atlantic crossing were bought and sold in markets as soon as they arrived. Many of them were branded, most often on the cheek. Next slide, please. And these enslaved individuals, these enslaved Africans, performed many different kinds of labor. Everything from housekeeping, specialized craft production. Next slide, please. But the vast majority of them were put to work as agricultural laborers in the sugarcane and tobacco plantations on the coast of Brazil. And here you have a 17th century engraving that you can see depicting a sugar mill, or engenho, in Pernambuco, in the northeast of Brazil. You can just, if you look closely, and I suggest you maximize your screens so you can look at the details. If you look closely enough, you'll see some of these enslaved workers pointed out in the scene. Next slide, please. These enslaved laborers who worked in the sugarcane farms planted, harvested, and ground the sugarcane. And obviously all parts of this work were extremely tough. But perhaps the most dangerous part was the harvest and the processing, because that involved, as you can see, grinding the sugarcane and boiling the juices so as to turn it into sugar. Now, accidents were apparently very frequent at this stage of the process. So people would often get mutilated on top of everything else they had to endure. In fact, it seems that working conditions in these sugarcane farms were so harsh that by the late 18th century, the average life expectancy of an enslaved African in Brazil was only 23 years. And this meant that enslaved individuals were constantly brought from Africa. So it was a very profitable trade for some. Next slide, please. However, by the time we get to 1700, huge amounts of gold and diamonds were discovered in the area that is now Minas Gerais. And as you may know, Minas Gerais is Portuguese for general mines. Minas is mines. And again, this is the home state of UFMG. The MG in UFMG stands for Minas Gerais, as you obviously know. So this discovery of gold and diamonds started a gold rush, as I mentioned. And this gold rush lasted several decades. And it meant that the once sleepy little villages in the area, which were sparsely populated, all of a sudden grew into these major economic and cultural hubs in the 18th century. Next slide, please. And here you have some examples that I'm showing you of some of the most famous of these gold rush 18th century towns in Minas Gerais. That one is Ouro Preto. Next slide, please. That one is Sabará, which is very close to Belo Horizonte, the state capital, which is where I'm currently speaking from. It's just a half an hour drive from Belo Horizonte. Next slide, please. There you have another of these gold rush towns, the town of Tiradentes, charming place. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, the bulk of the gold that was taken out of the Minas Gerais mountains ended up in Portugal. And here you can see an example of 18th century Portuguese church, an example of an 18th century Portuguese church. That's the right one, thank you. That's an example of an 18th century Portuguese church that displays a lot, quite a lot, of golden architecture, as you can see. Next slide, please. Whereas, in contrast, this photo is a photograph of an 18th century gold mine in Ouro Preto, which is still standing, and it can still be visited. And it reminds us of just how dangerous and claustrophobic and life-threatening gold mining can be. In fact, indeed, any kind of mining in a pre-industrial context is a very dangerous and hazardous undertaking. Next slide, please. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about another aspect of this gold rush society that developed in Minas Gerais. Most historians agree that the gold rush society that developed in Minas was, in many respects, more dynamic than the kind of society that you get in the plantations on the coast. And this is because gold and diamonds are movable wealth. So it would have they would have made it relatively easier for people to try and climb the social ladder, as it were. For example, we know that many enslaved workers were able to buy their freedom or obtain their freedom by other means. And this was only if they were lucky enough to find enough gold or diamonds to satisfy their masters and also have some left over for themselves that they could use to buy their own freedom. And this is called manumission. Now, interestingly, we know that several of these manumitted slaves or freed slaves went on to acquire slaves of their own. Now, it's difficult to determine how common this practice was, but we know that it did happen. We do hear of several former enslaved individuals who were either African-born or African-descended, who, once they became free, went on to purchase their own retinues, like their own groups of enslaved workers who were either African-born or African-descended. One example of such an individual concerns a freed woman called Bárbara Gomes de Abreu e Lima. That is not her, by the way, the image that you're seeing. That's just a depiction of a freed woman from the early 19th century, although this Bárbara may well have looked like that. Now, what's interesting about Barbara is that not only did she reside in prime real estate, she was able to get a house that faced the main church of Sabara, which was a big deal. Not only that, she was also apparently the owner of 7 enslaved individuals, along with pieces of jewelry, pieces of silverware. Enslaved individuals were seen as property, as wealth. Next slide, please. And there's a professor here at UFMG in the history department, a colleague of mine named Eduardo França Paiva, who wrote a very interesting book. You can see the cover. And in this book, he suggested that women such as Barbara may have been seen as a kind of role model at the time by other enslaved individuals. Now, obviously, that's not, the only possible interpretation. And whatever we make of Barbara's story, which is certainly very interesting, her case is perhaps a reminder of just how complicated the Brazilian slave society actually was. And it's perhaps also an indication that one of the long-lasting outcomes of the colonial encounter was the development of what we might call a slave-owning culture or a slave-owning mentality in Brazil. And this slave-owning mentality apparently pervaded all levels of colonial society, infiltrating the minds of people regardless of their social class, even the minds of those who were at the very bottom of this social hierarchy. Next slide, please. Now, that said, we really mustn't forget that there was also quite a lot of resistance among the enslaved populations during the colonial period, and later as well. Runaway slaves usually gathered in hideouts that were located far into the hinterland, where they were difficult to access. And some of these hideouts developed into actual towns, which are known as quilombos. And it's important to note that nowadays, the Brazilian government recognizes an official status, the status of quilombo remnant, which is a status that is given by the government to communities that probably originated as quilombos, or that claim to have originated as such. One of the most famous slave rebellions or slave revolts in Brazilian history is the so-called Malay Revolt of 1835. These Malay were enslaved Nigerians. They were literate Nigerians who had been taken to Bahia. And many of them, because they were literate, many of them apparently brought over with them their own copies of the Quran. And apparently their plan, when the rebellion happened, their plan was to create a kind of Islamic state in northeastern Brazil, in Bahia. This happened in Bahia, by the way. But they didn't get as far as that. The Malay revolt was found out and it was crushed, was ruthlessly crushed. But this happened in 1835, as I mentioned, and by that point, Brazil had already gained political independence from Portugal. Not only that, but efforts were being made to push the country into the new era of liberalism and industrialization that was dawning at the time. So now, at this point, I want to start looking together with you. I want to look closely at this, what I'm calling the modernization attempt. Next slide, please. There you have it. The modernization attempt. Let's try and look at it in a bit more detail, as much as possible. I want to start off by saying that because Brazil has such a peculiar historical background, even in terms of Latin American history, Brazil's pathway to modernity, so to speak, has been somewhat unique. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that Brazil was one of the last countries in Latin America to gain political independence. So in one way, this shows that the Portuguese state, right, the Portuguese crown, really did manage to keep a strong grip over the colony for a rather long period of time. For one thing, as you may know, interaction between the colony and the outside world was heavily guarded, was heavily restricted. For example, I'm not sure if you know this, but Brazilians were only allowed, in the colonial period, Brazilians were only allowed to trade with Portuguese colonists and no others. So the Brazilian ports were closed to non-Portuguese traders. Also, universities, what we might call universities and colleges, were not allowed in Brazil by order of the crown. Of course, one major exception to this were the Jesuit colleges that I mentioned previously. But these Jesuit colleges, like I said, were mainly focused on converting the natives, like the indigenous societies, into Catholicism. That was their main business. So there's that. And also, it's important to remember that the Jesuit colleges were banned in the 1750s because of rising tensions between the Jesuits, like the Catholic Church, and the interests of the Portuguese crown. Next slide, please. Another thing that was heavily curtailed by the Portuguese crown was industrial development, which is interesting because the fact that the Portuguese crown had to make efforts to limit or curtail this kind of activity suggests that it was happening, that it was developing in Brazil independently. One example of this is refers to the year of 1785. So obviously, 1785 is when you have the Industrial Revolution taking off in places such as Britain. So while that was happening, the Portuguese queen at the time, a woman called Maria, Dona Maria, issued a decree which went on to become very famous among Brazilian historians, a decree forbidding manufactories in Brazil. So the whole system, as you can see, was geared towards keeping Brazil as subordinate as possible and as isolated from the outside world. I mean, one thing meant the other. One thing then led to the other, or was supposed to lead to the other. Like isolation was the tool to keep the colony subordinate, a strategy. And perhaps the greatest control mechanism that the Portuguese crown had at its disposal was the fact that no one in Brazil was allowed to actually own land. Landed property, that is. Technically, what happened was that all the land belonged to the crown, and the crown had the power to lease out this land to whoever it wished. So everybody was at best a tenant, as you can conclude. So some historians think that this had a big impact on colonial society, on Brazilian colonial society and culture, a lasting impact that would have lasted well beyond the colonial period itself. For one thing, it's possible that the absence of private property made it difficult for a sense of autonomy and self-determination to take root among colonial society, in colonial society. Next slide, please. All of this might explain why it was that the lead up to Brazilian independence in the early 19th century was directly connected with the weakening of the Portuguese crown at the time. So let's look at the context in more detail. We're talking here about the rise, at the time when Napoleonic France started its expansion in Europe, threatening other European monarchies, including the Portuguese monarchy. So basically, when Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1808, the Portuguese royal family decided that it was time to relocate or flee, depending on your point of view. They decided it would be a good idea to relocate to Rio. And apparently there was this idea of moving the Portuguese court to Brazil was something that was already talked about as early as the mid-18th century. So it was already a possibility that, that existed, and it was put in action finally in the early 19th century because of the Napoleonic invasion. So the Portuguese court relocated to Rio in 1808. And historians agree that this move had far-reaching implications. One of which was the implication that for the very first time in Brazilian history, Brazilian ports were opened to merchants from other European nations, other than the Portuguese themselves. And here it's important to point out that the British were the first to take advantage of this. So it wasn't long before the United Kingdom became Brazil's main trading partner. And it's just possible that British commercial interests played a role in the political developments that happened after Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, and the Portuguese crown moved back to Lisbon in 1821. Next slide, please. There was some fighting involved. Some fighting took place in 1822 and in 1823. But after this fighting, Brazilian political independence was acknowledged by the leading powers of the time, chiefly the United Kingdom. And the first constitution of Brazil was drafted in the year 1824. And this constitution is a very interesting document. It determined, for example, that Brazil was to become a constitutional monarchy. And by the way, this was the first of 7 constitutions that Brazil has had during its history as an independent nation. After the Constitution of 1824, the original one, others followed in 1891, 1934, 1937, 1946, 1967, and finally 1988. So the 1988 Constitution is the one that is still in place to this day. Coming back to the early 19th century, It's worth pointing out that Brazil was only one of two American nations that adopted a monarchical political regime after independence, the other being Mexico, as you may know. But the Brazilian monarchy was a lot longer lived than the Mexican monarchy. And the reason why they chose a monarchy is one of those difficult questions about Brazilian history that we won't really have time to go into in too much detail, unfortunately. Suffice it to say that many factors may have contributed to this, including possibly the coming of the Portuguese court and the installation of the Portuguese monarchy in Brazilian territory, where it remained for 10 years. So that might have had something to do with it. Next slide, please. At any rate, one of them, I said that the 1824 Constitution is an interesting document, and one of the most interesting things about it is that it was relatively inclusive. And here I really want to stress the word relatively. Because according to this Constitution, any free or freed person, right, a freed person being a formerly enslaved person who acquired their freedom, any free or freed person born in Brazilian territory, on Brazilian soil, was, at least theoretically, according to the Constitution, entitled to Brazilian citizenship, regardless of race. And that's what I meant by relatively inclusive, the Constitution being relatively inclusive. Because this is something that contrasts, obviously, with the racially based exclusion that we see developing in the US, for example, at around that time. On the other hand, the 1824 Constitution excluded enslaved individuals, obviously, based on what I just said, and it also excluded indigenous groups from citizenship. And it was also exclusionary from a socioeconomic point of view, in the sense that only the wealthy were allowed to hold public office. So this was very much, as you can see, an oligarchical constitution that placed political power firmly in the hands of the landed gentry. And indeed, it would be fair to say that this oligarchic aspect of Brazilian politics continues into the, to this day, continued into the 20th century and is still very much alive, some would argue. Next slide, please. In terms of social developments, the 19th century is when we see the first major efforts at modernizing Brazil. And one major aspect of this was the transition from slavery to free labor. Now, this was a very slow and gradual transition, perhaps slower than in other places. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that it's a process that's still not quite finished, because many of the hangovers from the time of slavery are still very much with us in Brazilian society to this day. Next slide, please. We know for sure that even after the even after the British government abolished formally the slave trade in 1807, and this was after decades of, British merchants profiting from the slave trade. In 1807, the British government decided to abolish the slave trade. But even after that, for several decades, enslaved Africans carried on being brought in huge numbers from Africa to Brazil throughout the 19th century and well into the 1880s. Next slide, please. But by that point, the arrival of European immigrants was starting to gain momentum and was starting to have an impact. So just to give you an idea, I gave you numbers pertaining to the enslaved Africans. Between 1884 and 1959, over 4 million people from Europe and the Near East emigrated to Brazil. So 4 million, that's more or less the same number that I gave you for the enslaved Africans brought over from between the 16th century and the late 19th century. So again, we're talking about a huge influx of people. Next slide, please. And the bulk of these European immigrants, most of them, settled in the southern areas of Brazil, in the south and the southeast. The Italians, who came over in huge numbers, concentrated in São Paulo, while the Germans and also some Italians settled in the southernmost states of Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná. Unfortunately, I don't have a map to show you, but you can maybe Google one. And these immigrants formed close-knit communities, especially the ones that settled in the south. Very close-knit communities who actually made a point of retaining their own native dialects, such as the Hunsrückisch dialect in the case of German immigrants, and also certain types of Venetian dialects in the case of Italians, because most of the Italians came from the Veneto region. Now, European immigration didn't happen out of the blue, right? It was sponsored. It was sponsored by the Brazilian government at the time. And this was because the Brazilian government was very much interested in that context, in Europeanizing Brazil as much as possible, like I mentioned earlier. So this is the moment of the modernization attempt is also the Europeanization attempt, you could say. And this is a trend that is not exclusive to Brazil, obviously. You get the same thing in other Latin American countries at around the same time, especially Argentina, Brazil's southerly neighbor. Next slide, please. And it was also in the second half of the 19th century that the first Brazilian railways were constructed. And these railways were crucial for the coffee boom. Remember the coffee boom? They were crucial for the coffee boom that was beginning to take off in São Paulo, in the southeast of Brazil. And it's important to remember that these railways, these 19th century railways, were built by the British, and they were actually named, they were given English language names. So that was the image that you're seeing is a stretch of the São Paulo Railway. That's what it was actually called in Brazil, the São Paulo Railway in English. Next slide, please. It was coffee. It was coffee that financed the astonishing urban growth and industrial development of São Paulo. Next slide, please. As you may know, São Paulo is currently one of the biggest cities in the world, and it's also the main economic and financial hub of Latin America. So in terms of modernization, you could say that São Paulo is one of Brazil's biggest success stories, in a way. Although obviously it's not all about success. Next slide, please. Brazil was one of the last countries, like I mentioned, I think, well, I may have mentioned it, I'm not sure. Brazil was one of the last countries in the Americas to abolish slavery formally. And this happened in the case of Brazil in the year 1888. But it's important to remember that the formal abolition of slavery didn't really solve the social issues that slavery caused. On the contrary, there was no real concern on the part of the state to integrate the former slaves, the formerly enslaved individuals, into society. So these people continued to be regarded as subhuman by the political establishment of the time, which is dreadful. And the political establishment of the time, it's important to note, was strongly, like I mentioned just now, was strongly committed to supporting European immigration and creating a European labor force in Brazil. To the extent that, to this day, what you get is the descendants of enslaved individuals, enslaved Africans, are still socially disadvantaged. They face poverty, insecurity, and marginalization. And that's something we need to do something about. Next slide, please. And this overall situation didn't change much after the constitutional monarchy was overthrown and a Republican government was put in its place in 1889, 1 year after the abolition of slavery. It was this so-called First Republic, or Old Republic, that basically ran Brazil up until 1930, so the first few decades of the 20th century. And of course, this First Republic, as it's known, was practically monopolized by the coffee moguls of São Paulo. And this shouldn't come as a great surprise. So that is a satirical sketch that you're seeing. It pokes fun at the fact that there wasn't really much change, not much changed with the installation of the Republic. So it shows that people were very much aware of this at the time. Next slide, please. The eventual demise of this First Republic, this oligarchical republic, in 1930, came with yet another military coup. I may have mentioned that the First Republic was installed through a coup, and then there was another coup in 1930 that did away with the Republic and installed Brazil's first populist government, which was led by a man called Getúlio Vargas. He's the one with the cigar in the center of the image. Now, this man Vargas was responsible for some key social reforms that were very long overdue. Next slide, please. Many of these reforms responded to popular demands that were piling up and that had been basically ignored by the Republican elite until then. These demands included such things as the creation of workers' rights, legislation, and also the minimum wage, because there was no such thing in Brazil until then. It's no surprise that Vargas came to be known as the father of the poor, pai dos pobres. And it's also no surprise that many cities, many streets in Brazilian cities are named after him. But it's possible that Vargas wasn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart. And this is because in 1937, he tightened his grip on power under the pretense that the country was being threatened by a Jewish communist conspiracy, which, of course, turned out to be a total hoax, but nonetheless, it worked. It was an excuse that allowed Vargas to shut down Congress, ban political parties, and suspend all civil liberties. Next slide, please. It was under this dictatorial regime that Brazil entered World War II in 1942. Although Vargas had close ties with Nazi Germany, also because of certain ideological affinities that they shared, Brazil ended up fighting on the side of the Allies. And this may have been owing to US support for the construction of a power plant, a major power plant in Rio. Anyway, after the war ended and Vargas ran out of steam, as it were, a new constitution was passed in 1946. And then Vargas went on to commit suicide, in a rather grandiose manner, in 1954, just as new attempts, a whole new wave of attempts at modernization were underway. Next slide, please. This was very much the war cry of newly elected President Juscelino Kubitschek, who was elected in 1955 democratically. Huge incentives were given during Kubitschek's term as president to the automobile industry in particular. So that was when roads were built, highways were built all across the country, and the production of automobiles received a huge boost. Next slide, please. It was also Kubitschek who supervised the construction of Brasilia, which was the new federal capital. Until then, it had been Rio, you may know this, until 1960, which is when Brasilia was inaugurated as the new federal capital. It was Rio that occupied the position of the federal capital, Brazil's capital. And Brasilia has all this glaring modern architecture, as you may know. And I, for one, think it's got a nice visual impact, but not many people agree. Next slide, please. Internationally, this context of the 1950s and early 1960s was characterized by Brazil's growing alignment with the US. Obviously, this was the context for the next major political event that shook the country in 1964. And yes, you guessed it, this was yet another military coup. So just to backtrack a little, in 1961, Kubitschek's successor, also democratically elected, resigned after just a few months in office. And the vice president, a man named João Goulart, took over as president. Now, this Goulart was seen as a communist. He was seen as a communist revolutionary by the Brazilian middle and upper classes, and also by the military establishment. So Goulart, and this was because Goulart wanted to promote things like land reforms, agrarian reforms. And this may have been perhaps the key factor behind the coup, the military coup, that ousted Goulart in March 1964. There was, now at the time it wasn't clear, but now it's clear that there was some degree of US support for this. Because the US viewed the Brazilian military as a kind of emergency brake on what were regarded as growing left-wing tendencies in Brazilian politics at the time. And obviously we need to remember that this was the Cold War era. Next slide, please. Now, this most recent military coup, the 1964 one, and the ensuing military dictatorship, was marked by episodes of, on the one hand, economic growth, accelerated economic growth, and on the other hand, by brutal oppression and serious protests against the dictatorship as well. Next slide, please. These protests against the dictatorship sometimes took on violent forms, such as guerrilla warfare. The Araguaia guerrilla, for example, was a communist-inspired movement led by middle-class university students from São Paulo. Next slide, please. Their aim was to bring about a kind of grassroots peasant revolution from the deep hinterlands of Brazil, more or less along Maoist lines. This movement, however, failed, and the Araguaia guerrilla, were crushed by the Brazilian military in the early 1970s. And that's one of the rare photographs that you have of people who were a part of that movement before it was crushed. Next slide, please. So now we come to the really difficult question. Where do we go from here? So, next slide, please. Like I said, I'm gonna leave the current affairs, like the really messy current affairs, to my colleagues. And I'm just gonna wrap up by saying that the redemocratization of Brazil began in the early 1980s. In 1984, a series of mass protests happened throughout the country, and people were demanding the return of direct presidential elections, which had been suspended since 1964. And since then, Brazil has had more or less balanced periods of right and left-wing governments. And although some progress has been made, there are still very serious challenges that the country needs to overcome. And again, you're going to hear a lot more about this in the coming lectures about Brazilian current affairs, race, society, culture. So keep an eye out for that. Perhaps one of Brazil's biggest challenges from a historical point of view, which is what I can talk about more authoritatively, is coming to terms with its slave-owning past, which, like I said, still makes itself felt in the form of racism, social inequality, the lack of a communal spirit, we could say, and also in view of authoritarian tendencies that are still with us. As I noted in the beginning of my talk, dealing with these issues involves not only political measures, such as passing laws, which obviously is very important, passing laws and enforcing them, of course. It also, changing also involves changing people's basic outlook on what society should be, and that's a lot more difficult to do. And we have history to show us that it can be a very difficult process. Feasible, but difficult. I think that the study of history has a big role to play in this regard. Because while history shows us that we are a product of the past, it also shows us that we're not prisoners of our own past or of other people's past, for that matter. To be sure, history is all about asking questions. I said at the beginning that it was all about time, but it's also about asking questions, like other kinds of science. And you'll have noticed from my talk that there are many things about Brazilian history that we still don't quite understand. And I think we need to own up to that. I think we need to own up to the fact that we don't understand everything about what happened and about, how it was that we came to be where we are. And that's what makes it interesting, history, I mean, in my opinion. Many questions are still unanswered, and others are yet to be asked, are yet to be formulated. When we go down to the nitty-gritty, I think that historical inquiry presents us with some very complex and even contradictory realities, which are sometimes difficult to try and turn into coherent narratives, which is one of the things I tried to do in my talk. At any rate, I'm not sure if I succeeded in doing that, but I do hope that this very brief introduction will further stimulate your interest in Brazilian history and also all things Brazilian. So thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Rafael, thank you so much. That was so insightful and a very, very nice way to start our series of sessions. We have very little time, but I would like to try and ask a couple of questions some of the students made. And I'm gonna, there's Yuta Kimoto from Japan. He's the vice consul in Rio. And I'm going to add a little bit to that question. He's asking, I would like to know more about the hangover of the slave system in Brazil after 1888. Could you tell us about the legacy of slavery on subsequent immigration to Brazil, for example? And maybe you can go back a little bit. When slavery was extinguished in Brazil, I have this feeling that it was kind of done on the spot and without much thinking, like Princess Isabel signing a piece of paper. Were there any talks before that for compensations, for example, for these enslaved people? Was this even mentioned at any point?
Well, thank you very much for the question. It's very much to the point of one of the main things I tried to get across in my talk. And thank you, Luciana, for adding to the question, because that's what you say is really important. So in terms of the legacy of slavery, and I think this is one of the really big issues that we have to deal with, and I think it manifests itself in different shapes and in different guises, very different guises. So we're talking about a multifaceted phenomenon here. We see this legacy of slavery in several areas of social and political life in Brazil, I would say, both in public spheres as well as private spheres. So in general terms, I pointed to issues such as racism, for example. I see racism as a huge hangover from this, as a huge problem that can be regarded as a legacy of slavery. The fact that, like Luciana pointed out, once the abolition papers were signed officially, there was no real effort, no real concern for the state to develop strategies to integrate the formerly enslaved individuals into society. So these people were pretty much left to their own devices. And like I said, they were pretty much still seen by the establishment as people who were not worthy of state attention, not worthy of, not valuable enough in terms of justifying state interventions. So they were still regarded as subhuman in, by the political establishment, which I think is absolutely dreadful. So that, there was a lot that was done to revert that throughout the 20th century. and also in the 21st century. So social programs, incentives, government-sponsored activities, legislation, obviously. So we've come a very long way. But racism is still very much an issue, and you're going to have a talk about this, won't you? You're going to have a talk about race in Brazil. So obviously, the person who will be giving the talk will be able to inform you, more in a lot more detail as to these issues. But I can, to put things in a historical perspective, I think we can connect it with the slave-owning mentality that developed in the colonial period. In addition to racism, we have social inequality. So basically, people who have more advantages in life and less advantages, like the disadvantaged population, demographically speaking, the disadvantaged sectors of Brazilian society tend to be those made up of those people who descend from the enslaved individuals who were forcibly brought over. So that is another dimension in which I think the legacy of slavery manifests itself. The fact that you have huge income disparities, very huge income disparities between the people who descend from the enslaved workers and people who don't descend from the formerly enslaved individuals. So I think that's something that we need to take into account as well. With regard to, and also I think on a more basic level, we still have slave labor happening in Brazil. It still happens. It still goes on. It's still going on. This is, it's incredible that in the early 21st century, this kind of thing is still, is still present. But it is. I mean, if you get like every now and then you hear about people working in conditions analogous to slavery. That is the official way of phrasing it, like what you see in the news. And also the official stance of the government, like when they find out about these cases where people are forced to work in conditions that are analogous to slavery. In other words, they work for food, they work for shelter, right? They're not paid, or they're paid like an absolute minimum amount, which is below the minimum wage. So that's to do with culture. Again, it's to do with the way people view themselves and they view their relationships to other people in society. It's a really sort of deeply rooted thing that's difficult to get rid of. But I think we are making headway. I think we are. I don't want to sound too negative. I'm just, I'm trying to be realistic, but at the same time, I mean, I realize that one can be overly pessimistic. So we have to look at what's been, accomplished as well in those respects. So I think those are three examples of the legacy of slavery as we can view it in contemporary Brazilian society. In terms of Luciana's addition to the question, yes, there were discussions in intellectual circles ever since the mid-19th century. Well, ever since the early 19th century, with the abolitionist movement in Europe, North America, and also Brazil. It was something that was talked about. In fact, I mean, if you go all the way back to antiquity, which is what I'm, more of an expert on, you get a sense that there was always a sense in which people viewed slavery as an unnatural state of affairs, right? An unnatural state of affairs, and you get that ever since ancient Greece and ancient Rome. You get people saying, well, it's maybe this isn't the way it was meant to be. Maybe we're doing something wrong here, and this, I think, this is you have a very deep kind of train of thought, that a tendency to view slavery as unnatural, as something that needs to be gotten rid of, and I think that fed into the abolitionist movement. It was one of the deep strands that fed into the 19th century abolitionist movement. So you get lots of public figures, public intellectuals in Brazil in the 19th century who speak out against slavery and who speak in favor of somehow integrating these formerly enslaved people into society in a way that was dignified and that would have allowed these people to set up for themselves and live their own lives in a dignified way. But for some reason, even though you do have the ideas, you do have the debates, you do have the discussions, that apparently did not cause much of an impact in the way that the Brazilian government behaved in practice. So as you say, it was very much, it was very much an ad hoc thing. Well, a piece of paper was signed, and that was that. And of course, that didn't create, it didn't generate concrete results immediately, because people, some people ignored it. There are reports about European immigrants arriving in Brazil in the late 19th century and going to work in these coffee farms in Sao Paulo that were, until that date had been employing slave labor, and which carried on employing slave labor to some extent. And so these, even in the case of these new arrivals, these European arrivals, some of them complained, and we have historical documents that indicate this. Some of these people complained that they were being treated as slaves, and that's not very difficult to believe. It's not. When you think about what you said about the sort of hurried way in which the whole thing was done. Obviously, it would have been, it took a while for these new laws and regulations to seep through and begin to seep through. So yes, it's I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it's there are all these elements that we definitely.
I know it's not. Yeah, it's not as simple as, but it was excellent.
But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right to I think it was great that you made that comment, because it shows us that things don't always move in the same direction. And you have in the same society, you can have like intellectuals, and you can have public figures that are concerned about something, and whereas the establishment just doesn't is not in tune. It's on a whole different level, like an entirely different wavelength. So we're talking here about the coexistence of different ways of viewing reality that you can have, like in the same given historical reality, which is really interesting. It shows us that society is complex.
Marcos, I think we have time for one more, right?
Yes, I guess we have. We have a question from Mathilde de Souza. She's a student at University of Lille in France. And she says, you mentioned the influence that the UK had on Brazil. It's interesting, as we usually hear about the US influence on Brazil or about the UK influence on Argentina. Why did you choose to talk about the UK influence on Brazil? And to what extent did the UK, or do they still have an economic, social, political influence in Brazil?
So I'm just writing this down. Thank you for your question. I chose to talk about the UK's influence because of the narrative framework that I employed in my talk. I was talking about events leading up to Brazilian independence, political independence in 1822, and all the historical factors that probably contributed to that, and also that shaped the way in which Brazil developed as an independent nation during the first decades of independence. So if you're going to talk about that, you need to talk about the UK instead of the US, right? Because the UK seems to have been the defining, like a crucial factor in that specific historical context. Of course, if I were to talk about the 20th century in greater detail, which I didn't do, I focused more on the pre-20th century developments, because it's a huge amount of data, as you'll have noticed, and given the choice between talking about sort of the more sort of remote past, which isn't really that remote when you come to think about it, and the more recent events, I chose to speak more about the pre-modern, like the pre-20th century scenario. And that's what led me to go on about the UK, because at that time, it was arguably the UK and not the US that was there was a major player in world politics, not just in relation to Brazilian history, world politics in general. Like when you think about the fact that the United Kingdom was the only nation in the world in 1846 that owned a steel ship, like a steel gunship made of steel. You know, it was the only country in the world that had that. So obviously the UK was a major player in the 19th century, like in geopolitics, economy, you name it, right? And that manifests itself in Brazilian history. So early 19th century Brazilian history is a way of talking about the rise of British imperialism, right? So that, I mean, and at the time, the US was a young nation. They may have already had ambitions, certain ambitions, but it was still very early on for them, right? They were latecomers to this situation of, you know, rising global, you know, capitalist global powers. So it is pretty much the UK that interferes, or well, maybe interfere is a loaded word. I should say that sort of is connected with developments in Brazil, but like between Brazil and Portugal. We mustn't forget that it was also the British who escorted the Portuguese royal court from Lisbon to Rio in 1808. So they were, you know, they had their fingers in all sorts of pies. They were interested in expanding their trade relations with Brazil, as they were, you know, with other parts of the world. The UK, I mean. So that's why historians tend to think that it was, you know, the fact that Brazilian political independence from Portugal happened when it happened might have had something to do with the rise of British global commercial interests and what you might call imperialism, right? Because the British were trying to get at Brazil's resources or exploit Brazil as a market. Independently from Portugal, like they wanted Portugal out of the picture, basically. So that is one way of viewing it, right? I'm not saying it's the only way that you can view the early 19th century events. It's one interpretation out of others, and this is something I also want to stress. Like you can and should take into account different interpretations of historical events. There is no single narrative. This is something I often stress to my students. There is no single narrative, right? Of course, there are things that, you know, that are unquestionable. But I mean, like in most cases, you really, it's a good thing to try and view events, processes from different points of, you know, from different perspectives. It is no longer the case that the UK is a major international force interfering in Brazilian society, economy, and politics. No, that is no longer the case. And again, I think this is down to broader historical developments, right? That are not just to do with Brazil. Like it's to do with the changing world order. The world order has changed between the early 19th century and nowadays. I mean, in many respects, it hasn't changed, but it has in others. And one of the ways it has changed is in terms of the international geopolitical distribution of power, right? The power balance, as political scientists call it. I'm not sure if we have any political scientists with us in our talk. Maybe you can shed some light on that.
I was gonna mention that you are running away from the mess we're living nowadays, and Professor Casarões is going to be talking exactly about the mess. So
it is a mess, and it's funny when I tell people I'm a historian. They've been saying, like, I've been getting people tell me, so you must be at a complete loss.
How are you going to teach your students that?
Like, as soon as I tell people I'm a historian, they tell me, well, so you must have no idea what's going on. Like, you must be having a hell of a difficult time trying to come to get to grips with what's happening. And I tell them, yeah, well, that's exactly it. Especially in my case, since I tend to focus on the ancient world.
Good for you.
Well,
you should.
as an escape route, maybe.
I know.
No, it's actually a way of looking at our reality from different, from a different angle, which can be very enlightening. Yes. So again, that's pretty much what I have to say about the question.
Excellent, Professor. Once again, it's been an honor having you with us in our summer school, as usual. Brilliantly put, brilliant speech. Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Office of International Affairs and Professor Aziz, I also thank you for being here. We have more questions, and we're going to see if they actually do want to maybe forward it to us, and then we can talk later for some of the questions. And lots of thank you, Professor. That was great. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the lecture. So everybody, I guess, enjoyed it very much. And then now, please, Marcos, you have some final announcements before we leave.
Yeah, so we're going to have a break, right? Now a 30-minute break, and then we're going to be back to the Portuguese for Foreigners classes. And also, like Luciana said, I would like to remind you all that tomorrow we have a special session with Professor Casarões, with his lecture titled From Boom to Bust, How Emerging Power Brazil Became a Global Power.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right on the spot.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's open our cameras so that we can take a picture. What do you think?
Great idea. I've got mine.
And also, I can see everybody's faces. I didn't get a chance to see everybody's faces yesterday. Oh, lots of people. Nice. Nice to see all your faces. Good. Okay. Will you also do that, Marcos and Henrique? Taking a picture. I smile. Thank you. Okay.
Okay.
So I'll see you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for inviting me again.
Thank
and it's been
you.
a huge pleasure. And yes, do forward the questions to me. I'll try and answer them as quickly as possible.
Great. Excellent. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye. Bye-bye.
See you in a bit.